Hello, JBS viewers. I'm David Harris, and this is Defending Israel. Our guest this week is a distinguished politician and statesman from the United Kingdom and a dear friend, Ian Austin. For 14 years, he served as a member of the House of Commons, and for the last 4 years, he's been a member of the House of Lords. Lots of dramatic events are taking place both in Britain and the United States. This is an opportunity to explore what's going on across the pond. Ian, welcome to JBS's Defending Israel.
Thank you very much, David. It's great to be here, and it's good to see you, as always.
Thank you, Ian. Before we look at today's events and think about the future, I want to go back in time for a moment to talk about your family, your upbringing, because I think, at least in one important dimension, it has bearing on our conversation. Could you spend a moment on that?
Sure. What's the background to this? My dad was Jewish. My mum wasn't. I wasn't brought up in a Jewish household, but he was a refugee from the Holocaust. He arrived in the UK in 1939. At the age of 10, he was put on a train by his mum and his two teenage sisters. He came to the UK. He actually could only speak only 3 words of English when he arrived here, which were hot, cross, and bun. But he ended up, he became a head teacher, one of the youngest head teachers in the country. And he brought up four kids, of whom I'm the second. And I think it's a great thing about our country, actually. I think not about me, but about our country, that the son of a refugee, a penniless refugee, can end up in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. I think that's a great thing about Britain. But that meant that I grew up listening to my dad talk about the Holocaust, teach us that prejudice can lead to hatred and to persecution. It gave me a lifelong commitment to fighting racism and prejudice. I remember as a child being visited by relatives from Israel, some of whom we didn't know we had. But in the sort of, my parents went to Israel in the 60s, and then in the 70s, we were meeting different branches of the family that had survived, or cousins, or children of cousins, and all the rest of it, some of whom actually were in the States. So I grew up with a sort of understanding and awareness of these issues. And it's left me, as I say, not just with a lifelong commitment to fighting racism, but a lifelong commitment to supporting Israel as well. And obviously in the current climate, that's taking up quite a bit of time in politics in the UK, just as I'm sure it is in politics in the US as well.
Ian, and before we turn to the politics of today, what happened to your father's mother and siblings?
Okay, so they were, it's a very interesting story. They were rounded up, forced out of the apartment they lived in, made first to live in a ghetto, and were then transported to Theresienstadt, and from there to Treblinka, where they were murdered in October 1942. And I've seen, I've been back to Ostrava, the town in the eastern part of what's now the Czech Republic. I went there with my dad and my eldest 2 kids. We found the apartment that he lived in. He pointed up at the window on the first floor. He said, "That's the room I slept in." And he told me how he remembered the night he was woken up by a noise in the street. He looked out of the window, and it was the German soldiers marching into the town square. And that was the day that Ostrava had been, I think it was a couple of days after the invasion, and it was the day that they went into that town. And he was put on a train just a few days later by his mum and sisters. And it's interesting, because when we talk about the Holocaust and you're taught, 6 million is a sort of unfathomable number. What does it mean? But when you visit a place and you hear that, there were 5,000 Jewish people who lived there, there were 6 synagogues, there were Jewish schools, Jewish shops, a vibrant Jewish community. And when you go back there today and you discover that the synagogue is now one room on the first floor of a building, and that first floor is the Jewish Community Center, and there are seats in the synagogue for 24 people. And that, for me, when you see the evidence of a community eradicated, for me is such powerful evidence of the Holocaust. When you see the impact in an individual town or an individual community, completely wiped out.
Very powerful. So you never had the opportunity to meet your grandmother, of course, like so many other victims of the Holocaust.
Sure.
Ian, you chose.
Sure. But look, David, we have relatives in Israel to whom I'm very close. My dad's cousin, an amazing story. My dad's cousin survived the war and the Holocaust in Siberia with his family, emigrated to Israel in the early 50s. His wife had been hidden in an orphanage in Romania, and she went to Israel again in the 50s. They met, they studied at Technion. She became one of the world's leading water scientists, and he ran the Carmel Winery in Rishon LeZion. And their kids are my age, right? And for me, that family actually shows the miracle that is Israel. People arrive with nothing, refugees from the Holocaust, refugees from the war, and look what they helped build. Look at the miracle they built in that part of the world. An extraordinary story, yeah.
Ian, we're going to come back to Israel in a moment, but
Sure.
You chose as your career a career in politics, and you joined the Labour Party, and you were a member of the Labour Party for many years until you chose to leave the Labour Party. And this again feeds into the story we're talking about. Why did you choose the Labour Party in the first place, and why did you choose to leave it?
Well, for the same reason, to fight racism. Look, I joined the Labour Party as a teenager in Dudley, in a town that I represented in Parliament. And I joined the main thing for me, with the background I had and the upbringing I had, I joined the Labour Party because in that era, in the 1970s and the 1980s, racism was mainly seen as something on the right. And if you wanted to fight racism, the Labour Party had a proud record of standing up for justice, standing up for equality, fighting racism. It was on the side of oppressed black people in South Africa under apartheid. That was the Labour Party's reputation. And that's the party I joined as a teenager. And that's the party I worked for. I was a member of staff. I was the spokesman to the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Subsequently became Prime Minister Gordon Brown. I worked with Tony Blair. I worked on Tony Blair's election campaigns. So I served the Labour Party as a local councillor in Dudley. So the Labour Party had been my life, the longest relationship in my life, really, apart from my relationship with my parents, obviously. And then when Jeremy Corbyn became the Prime Minister, became the leader of the Labour Party, fortunately he never became Prime Minister, but became
that was a Freudian slip.
Yeah. I mean, well, we were lucky. We worked hard to prevent it as well. But but I knew what my responsibility was, and I was appalled that a party with a proud record of fighting racism could become poisoned by antisemitism under the hard left. I thought it was a really shocking turn of events, and I knew what my responsibility was, and I fought against his leadership, and I fought against the racism that affected the party, that poisoned the party from day one. And in the end, when it proved impossible to get rid of him, I thought, well, you can't be part of this. And so I left the Labour Party in February 2019. And then I sat as an independent member of Parliament until the election later that year. The interesting thing, David, the thing that actually triggered I had been campaigning against his leadership, but in 2018, I went on March of the Living, which I'm sure you and many of your viewers will know well. And we were in the hotel in Krakow before we'd spent 5 days traveling around Poland, visiting all these sites. And then on the final day, we were waiting in the hotel lobby to go to Auschwitz, and I was introduced to a survivor of Auschwitz, a Holocaust survivor, a guy called Ivor Pearl, an amazing man. And they introduced me to him, and they said, Ivor, this is Ian Austin, he's a member of Parliament. And, you think, oh, this is nice, and you're being sort of treated like that. And he looked up at me and he said, which party? And I said, Labour. And his exact words were, are you not ashamed to be in the Labour Party with all the anti-Semitism? And the truth is, I was ashamed, and I had been campaigning against it. But I knew then, really that I was going to have to do more, that I couldn't continue with this.
Quite a story. Ian, you left the Labour Party. In 2020, as I mentioned, you became a member of the House of Lords. And Jeremy Corbyn is no longer the leader of that Labour Party. The Labour Party post-Corbyn, is it a party that you feel comfortable with today?
I think it is. Look, it is now very different from what it was under Jeremy Corbyn. There's no doubt about that. You could not say, it's not fair. It would not be fair to say that Keir Starmer is an extremist and much less an anti-Semite. You couldn't say that.
Viewers, Keir Starmer replaced Jeremy Corbyn as the leader of the Labour Party.
That's right. And look, some people, myself included, have criticised Keir Starmer for, serving alongside Jeremy Corbyn, being part of his team when he was the leader. Certainly since October the 7th, I have been, I think he has said and done pretty much the right things. If somebody had said to me, you're going to have a leader of the Labour Party who's going to stand up for Israel and support its right to defend itself and be prepared to take on people in the Labour Party to do that, I think many of us would not have believed that. So I think it is fair to recognise and to give him credit for what he's done since October the 7th.
And this is important, JBS viewers, because there is expected to be an election in Britain this year, 2024. And according to recent polls, the Labour Party is very likely to win, meaning Keir Starmer, the person you've been talking about, would enter 10 Downing Street as the next British Prime Minister. But Ian, let's go forward. Since October the 7th, Britain, and especially London, has been convulsed, particularly every Saturday, by mass marches, hundreds of thousands of people going through the centre of London. We've also seen scenes of the British flag desecrated, of historical monuments needing protection from assaults, including the cenotaph, and now most recently including a Holocaust monument. There's much more. How worried are you about what's going on in Britain today? Or to put it more dramatically, is this potentially Britain's future direction?
Well, I'm worried about what's happening in Britain, of course. I think when you've got, we've seen marches in Britain most weekends. There have now been 13 marches in central London, what they call national marches. The organisers claim they've had hundreds of thousands of people at some of them. They seem to be much smaller now than they were. But look, I've been down to see some of these demonstrations, some of these marches. You see lots of signs calling for Israel to be wiped out. You see signs calling for intifada. You see some signs which can only be described as anti-Semitic, comparing Jewish people to the Nazis or with swastikas on and things like this. You don't see any signs calling for peace, calling for a two-state solution. You don't see any signs calling for the hostages to be released. Of course, I'm very worried about this. I'm very worried about the fact that Jewish people feel intimidated out of going into London at weekends. I think that's completely unacceptable. I'm worried about the fact that there are people in our country who take the side of terrorists and extremists, Islamist extremists and Islamist terrorists, instead of standing up for the Middle East only democracy and one of our closest allies. So I'm very worried about all these things, of course. And I think that, I think the government has been pretty good on this so far, pretty steadfast in support of Israel. I mean, there's been the odd comment here and there that I don't agree with, of course. I think the opposition, led by Keir Starmer, has been pretty much in the same place as the government as well. But certainly the scenes on the demonstrations, I think, have been completely unacceptable. On the other hand, though, we had a big march against antisemitism, where we had over 100,000 people, and we had politicians from all the main parties. And that was a huge event and a great success. And that was an opportunity for ordinary people in Britain to come out and show their support for the Jewish community and to say, ordinary people in Britain do not support racism, do not support anti-Semitism, and want to stand up for their Jewish neighbours.
So one of the questions being asked, I'm sure there, and as you know, I'm in Britain quite often, but also here, is that one fellow who stood with a sign protesting the Saturday demonstration saying Hamas is terrorist and being removed from the scene, even though his sign reflected official British policy. And then more recently, the Jewish man who was wearing a kippah, who was stopped by the police and basically told this is a no-go zone for Jews. The complaint is the police are yielding to the mob rather than controlling the mob. Is that a fair criticism or not?
I think the problem is not the police. I think the problem is the protests. The problem is the protesters. I think the guy who was told by the police, who was wearing his kippah and was told to leave, I mean, he's a friend of mine. I've talked to him about it. I think actually the language the policeman used was clumsy and unfortunate. But what he was basically saying was, look, it's, I don't want you to walk through that demonstration because I don't think it's safe for you. So the issue is not the policeman trying to protect the guy or trying to preserve law and order and peace and all that. The issue is, who are these people on the demonstrations that are threatening Jewish people, right? I mean, that's the problem. Now, I'm not saying, of course, that everybody on these demonstrations is a racist or supports terrorism. Of course not, right? Some people are naive and they mean well and we see these young people sort of go along with all this stuff. But if there are 100,000 people on one of those marches or 200,000 people, even if, let's be really generous, let's be really, really generous to them, even if it was only 1 in 10 who is a racist or supports terrorism, I'm sure it's more, but let's say just 1 in 10, that would still be twice as many in number as the fascists who marched with Oswald Mosley in London in pre-war, before the war. These would still be, by any measure, the biggest racist demonstrations Britain has ever seen. And that is completely unacceptable. Now, the police have got a very difficult job here because they've got to preserve, they've got to prevent trouble. It's difficult under the law for them to ban these protests. So I think that's something that we should be looking at in Parliament. Does the law need tightening up? I think it does. So I think the police have got a tough job. And in the end, and look, of course, individual police officers, they make mistakes. Of course they make mistakes. But the big problem is not the police, it's the protests and it's the people on the protest. That's what we've got to be focused on.
Okay, Ian, point taken, but then that raises an even larger question. Because for those of us who have been following the process of immigration, integration, and identity during these mass migrations into Western Europe, including the United Kingdom, the question becomes, does Britain have a successful strategy for integration and acculturation? And many are arguing the answer is no, or partially at best. And the proof they offer is that in the second and third generation of the migrants from principally Muslim countries, there often seems to be less integration, more anger, more resentment, more pushback against the UK and its values and its history and its principles. Is that a fair or is that an unfair assessment? Does Britain have a national strategy today?
Well, I don't think we know enough about who the people on the protests are who are causing the trouble. I don't think we know enough about that. And I think more work needs to be done on that. I absolutely think we have got to be much more robust about defending our values, about standing up for what Britain means, about insisting that if you want to live in Britain, you've got to uphold our values. You've got to believe in democracy, equality, freedom, fairness, tolerance, equality between men and women. You've got to speak English. I think these things are non-negotiable. I really think we have to be much clearer about defending that. We've got to get that right with new arrivals, with new immigrants. We've got to get that right in schools. We've got to be much, much, much clearer about all of this. And we've got to get away from this sort of fashionable idea, particularly on the left, that you can't be sort of patriotic, you can't stand up for your country, you can't believe. I believe that, with the greatest of respect and apologies to the American, to you and Europe. I think this is the greatest country in the world. And when I say that, it is authentic, I mean it. And I believe that because of our values. And I think we have to be much clearer about this.
And would you say that both Rishi Sunak, the current Prime Minister, and Keir Starmer, who may be the next Prime Minister, would likely agree with what you just said, that we have to be much firmer, there have to be consequences, there have to be expectations, or would they disagree or try and thread the needle?
Well, Rishi Sunak made a speech recently saying exactly what I've just said. Mm-hmm. They've published new guidance on extremism with a list of organisations that the government shouldn't be having any contact with or support for. I think Keir Starmer is a patriot. But I think all of us in politics, everybody, I've been saying this stuff for 20 years, but I think we've all got to be, these marches, I think, are a wake-up call. And look, I think it's much bigger than this, because the truth is, I think, is that Iran has declared war on the West. It's declared war on our... We might not be at war with them, but I think they are certainly at war with us. I think Israel is the front line. I think we really have to understand this. I think the UK, the US, and the West in general, everything we stand for is opposed by the people running Iran, and they are. I think it is no exaggeration to say at war with us. No, I think and so I think that whether it's Israel, Ukraine. We have to stand up for democracy, stand up for our allies, and show that we're not going to allow Iran or Russia to. And look, let's be honest, right? Iran is in alliance with Russia in the war with Ukraine. It's the same argument, but certainly, as far as Western value goes, and the threat Iran poses to them, we really have to wake up to this. In both countries. I don't understand why it takes so, in the UK, we've not even yet prescribed the government won't prescribe the IRGC. Right. They say, it's ludicrous. They say, for example, we have to maintain diplomatic relations with Iran. I sort of think this is a country that kidnaps and imprisons British citizens. It sponsors terrorists to attack British ships. It sponsors terrorists to attack our allies. And it's developing nuclear weapons to wipe one of our allies off the face of the planet. So to what extent have these diplomatic relations proved any value over the last few years?
And Ian, I couldn't agree with you more, but I fear that there's a gap between what's said and what's done, both on the issue of integration. I read Rishi Sunak's speech, powerful speech on extremism. But the question is, will it be implemented in the form of policy with actual consequences? I completely agree with you on the subject of Iran and its network, including funding from Qatar, ideology from the Muslim Brotherhood, and offshoots, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis. But policy lags behind the statements. And in the race, we're falling behind, aren't we? And let me ask you another thing, if I may.
David, this is why we're in politics, right? To campaign, to push, to press all the time. And we have to be really uncompromising about this, and we have to demand more from our government in the UK, just as people like you and your colleagues, no doubt, are demanding more from your government in the US as well.
Absolutely, because you used the word. Ian, you used the word, you said they're at war with us. Yeah. They're at war with us. I think I'm quoting you.
Yeah, absolutely.
We are not at war with them. The question is, what should the proper response be? But we have only a couple of minutes left, Ian, and I want to squeeze in at least one or two more questions.
Sure, sorry. Yeah.
One of your former colleagues in the House of Commons recently announced that he was standing down rather than run again, Mike Freer.
Mike Freer, yeah.
Because he said he was under such threat from the Islamists that he chose not to stand for election again. Is that another warning sign of what's going on the ground in Britain, that a respected member of the House of Commons chose to give up his political career, at least as reported, because of fear of threats and intimidation? Is that where we are?
Completely unacceptable. But we've had, 2 years ago, we had a member of parliament attacked by and murdered by an Islamist terrorist. A couple of years ago, before that, we had a member of parliament murdered by a right-wing terrorist as well. But look, we have to. But as Mike Freer pointed out, and as the murder of David Amess shows, and as other terrorist attacks in Britain have demonstrated, there is an Islamist threat, and we have to wake up to that. We have to deal with it much more strongly and much more robustly. It is completely unacceptable to have people driven out of public life, driven out of public service because of concerns for their safety. Completely unacceptable.
And my last question, and I wish there was time for more, and believe me, there's so much to cover, but you're in Britain, but I'm sure you're also watching what's happening in the United States in recent days and weeks, especially on university campuses. I myself spent several years on British campuses as a postgraduate student and visiting scholar. And while we had concerns in Britain, I saw nothing in Britain that rivals what we're seeing today in the United States at universities like Columbia University. From your perspective, watching this red-green alliance playing out on campuses like Columbia, what's your reaction?
Pretty worried. I've met students in the UK who've been subjected to antisemitism on campus and have had their university life, which ought to be the best time of their lives, really affected by this. But as you say, I look at what's happening in the States with horror. And sadly, the thing that worries me, David, is often what happens in America, we can look forward to it arriving here in the UK pretty shortly afterwards. So we need to do much, much more about anti-Semitism on campus. Stand up for Israel, keep campaigning for the Middle East only democracy. We have to tell the truth about this conflict and stand up for our allies.
Is there a way to drive a wedge between the Islamists and the left-wingers, the Reds in the Red-Green Alliance, or is that beyond our capability?
Look, we have to be realistic about the scale of the challenge. We've been losing this argument on campuses in the UK, and I'm sure in the US as well, for a lot longer than just since October the 7th. And it's going to take a lot of hard work and some really imaginative campaigning to put this genie back in the bottle.
Yeah. JBS viewers, You're probably as frustrated as I am because there are so many more things to discuss with Ian Austin, but our time has run out. So please allow me to thank you, Ian, for joining Defending Israel. And JBS viewers, if you didn't know Ian Austin before from across the pond, you now know of a voice of exceptional courage and clarity and bravery and principle, who is standing with the state of Israel and strong in the fight against anti-Semitism and extremism. So thank you, Ian, and we look forward to further conversations. Bye-bye.